Hey there, this is Mr. Icarus, and welcome to yet another edition of Doom Mod Madness. This time round, we are checking out Brutal Wolfenstein, because let's face it, it was only a matter of time till Wolfenstein 3D got the good old-fashioned brutal treatment. So, what are the main differences here between this and the original Wolfenstein? Well, for one, the most obvious thing will be in the visuals department, because these maps, as you may have noticed, are not the originals. These are remake maps, as evidenced by actual textures for the ceiling and floor, also the lovely shining hanging fixtures that we've got kicking around as well. Some of them are in fact destructible. I'm not sure the chandeliers in that particular room are. Gave them a few shots, couldn't get them to break. Oh well. The other thing that you'll notice is that the pace of gameplay is significantly faster than that of the original. This is clearly a mod that has chugged down a few liters of energy drink. Blazkowicz here is certainly a hell of a lot more agile than he used to be. I remember using just the arrow controls for classic Wolfenstein 3D. You felt like a tank. You had the agility of a tank. Here, you're much more spry. You've got full advantage of WASD and mouse look, and you're generally gonna need it. Enemies pretty much open fire barely a second after laying eyes on you, and being able to duck and weave and strafe effectively will help you hang on to that precious health. Mouse look here will also enable you to take advantage of another significant feature in Brutal Wolfenstein, perhaps the most obvious feature of all, and that is turning your enemies into a fine red paste. Certainly one of the more entertaining aspects of my initial run here in Brutal Doom was taking aim squarely at a Nazi's face, letting off a few bullets, and watching that head pop off like a champagne cork, turning him into a bit of a red wine fountain. Getting my drinks mixed up here, but nonetheless it causes the ceilings and the floors to be coated liberally in the red stuff, and induces a few very amusing animations too. Another difference you may no doubt notice between this and the original Wolfenstein is that the arsenal of weaponry is a fair bit more expansive here. Where the original Wolfenstein had 6 weapon slots, 1 weapon to each slot, this game has 7 weapon slots, often with multiple guns assigned to each. This one in particular being one of my favorites. This right here is the STG-44, and from what I can tell, this is intended to replace the chain gun. And the thing that I really enjoy about this particular weapon is mostly the effect that it has on its enemies. Not only does it feel like a beast to fire, it also has a rather dramatic effect on the bodies of whoever you tend to aim it at. Case in point, enemies shot by this do a really cool animation where sometimes they'll often pause, there'll be about a second delay before they just explode into blood and guts. If you have enough sustained fire going on with this thing, you'll also find that enemies will generally just fall to pieces with the requisite guts spilling out all over the shop, and limbs as well, which is nice. Now, the danger with an expanded arsenal in mods such as this is that it can quickly get overwhelming. You quickly just turn to the weapons that you favor the most. Happily, Brutal Wolfenstein does not dump the entire arsenal at your feet within the first few episodes. It gives you time to get used to a selection of them, figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of each before you decide on what's most appropriate for the given situation. For example, maybe not getting stuck in a reload animation with an enemy still in front of you, but nonetheless, the Kar 98 is very handy for taking out enemies long range, and what with Wolfenstein's penchant for long hallways, it'll definitely see its fair amount of use. As for the bosses here in Brutal Wolfenstein, if you remember them from the original, you'll sure as hell recognize them here. Nothing has really changed other than maybe a significant increase to the health pool, because boy do these fellas take a long time to take down. Yeah, you're not really going to be looking at any multi-phase, multi-attack boss battles here. It usually comes down to finding a good bit of cover, popping out when you've got the opportunity, and filling the boss full of lead. More often than not, you'll be running out of bullets for whatever gun you've chosen, and filling the boss with even more lead from another gun, until you run out of bullets for that one as well. Maybe chuck a few grenades, just for good measure. It seems designed just to run you dry, and Possibly the most challenging thing about the boss levels is making sure you've got enough health and enough ammo left over from dealing with the goons at the beginning to actually make the fight somewhat viable. If anything though, I only really found this more of a problem in the opening few episodes. It's something that definitely eases up as you progress through the entire campaign. Despite the commendable restraint to doling out the weaponry, sometimes it's just fun to cut loose, type in IDKFA, and just get your greasy hands on everything that Brutal Wolfenstein has to offer. Naturally, some of these guns are going to be more effective than others. There's some machine guns that are just flat-out powerhouses. The Thompson machine gun, for example, buries the MP40 in terms of fire rate and just satisfaction to fire. This baby right here turns enemies to paste in a very short amount of time, and you can totally see why they tried to dole out the weapons carefully rather than all at once. As I said earlier, that can often result in the player just defaulting to the biggest and baddest gun in the arsenal, and when that happens, you have a pretty steep drop-off in terms of actual challenge. It just becomes pretty routine, unless you're playing something ridiculous like a slaughter map, for example. Speaking of which, as far as I can tell, cross-compatibility is something planned for future releases of Brutal Wolfenstein. It isn't actually something that's been implemented as of yet, this version that I'm currently playing being the 4.5 release. So naturally, all sorts of bells and whistles can be added between now and then. Also, this pistol reminds me quite a lot of the laser pistol out of Fallout 3. Just saying. Also, it has a very intriguing effect on enemies. I'm not sure if I'd call it brutal. It's certainly interesting, turning him into a charred corpse of sorts. I was just hoping for more, maybe flame and screaming and blood splatter. You know me, I'm kind of a sicko like that. The more ridiculous and over-the-top, the better, in my opinion. We've also got the Bazooka here, which is a fixture of the original Wolfenstein. Does its job admirably, which is making enemies go boom with a rocket being launched from its business end. And this probably is the worst possible place to be using it, these cramped, confined hallways. Definitely something more for open spaces and longer ranges, that's for sure. But despite the inclusion of weapons such as the laser gun that can turn enemies into charred corpses and machine guns that can turn your enemies into literal mincemeat, I find that the arsenal here in Brutal Wolfenstein is probably a little too pedestrian for my tastes. It's lacking more of the bombast that I crave from this type of mod. I know that Brutal Wolfenstein is focusing more on the era of this game and more of the appropriate weaponry that can be included into it, but when you think of the Wolfenstein franchise as a whole, there is a wealth of interesting weaponry that you could potentially draft into this mod. Even if they weren't willing to go as far as Wolfenstein A New Order, they could still pilfer a few guns from Return to Castle Wolfenstein. You've got the Tesla gun, the Venom machine gun, and there's even the unfortunately forgotten Wolfenstein 2009, which had a few interesting weapons of its own too. But hey, you never know, they may all eventually find their way into future versions of Brutal Wolfenstein. So, bearing everything in mind, how do I feel about Brutal Wolfenstein? Well, you know what? It's pretty good fun. It's a really decent mod. And if that sounds like I'm being a little subdued, in my opinion, of Brutal Wolfenstein, that's because I've already seen this before. You gotta remember, I've already been concussed by the likes of Brutal Doom and Project Brutality. Both of those are mods that have taken this kind of concept and ran with it, so much so that they're pretty much specs on the horizon by now. But Brutal Wolfenstein feels like it's a little late to the party in some respects, still playing a little bit of catch-up. Then again, it's still early days for Brutal Wolfenstein. Things can and will change with future releases, and who knows how it'll look 2 or 3 versions down the line. What I can say with absolute certainty, however, is that this current version is really damn solid and quite good fun. I mean, I was able to sit down and blast through 3 episodes of Brutal Wolfenstein here before I started to feel any kind of significant fatigue, or maybe the pang of sameness, but let's face it, once you kill Hitler, everything tends to feel a little bit downhill from there. That's when I started screwing around with the IDKFAs. And if you're looking for an interesting way to experience Wolfenstein, you can do far worse than giving Brutal Wolfenstein a whirl for yourself. It's got a fair amount of challenge, it's got a hefty amount of guns, it's got bucket loads of gore, and if you want to try it out, the link, as usual, is in the description below. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and feel free to suggest any mods you'd like to see me cover in future episodes of Doom Mod Madness. This has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.